Are you lonely? Are you surrounded by nature, nothing but trees as far as you can see? Good, then you're the perfect prey. People are big and slow and easy to find. By the time you even decide to run, it will be too late, because everything in the woods that would want to devour you is faster than you and infinitely quieter. The good news is your life will be over before you even know what's happening. Good luck. You'll need it when you're alone in the woods. Enjoy these alone in the woods horror stories. Not long ago, I went camping in the Zagros Mountains as part of a last-minute post-college unwinding session. I finished my finals early, and I was getting ready to start working at a local law firm, but I wanted to see a bit more of the world first. On an impulse, I bought myself a ticket, and a few days later, I was flying out of the Boston International Airport. Before I knew it, I was standing at one of the trailheads, which started in the southwestern corner of the Iranian Plateau and ran for 14 miles until it merged with another trail. While I didn't have any idea about the local geography, I did have some pretty good navigation items on me, and the path was so straightforward that I wasn't worried about getting lost. My plan was to take 2 days to hike this trail. Then I'd head into one of the big cities and see some of the nightlife. I'd maybe find myself a girl or two to show me around, then I'd head back home by the end of the week. It was a foolproof plan, and I couldn't wait for my first night in those woods. Everything was perfect that day. I covered the first 7 miles, and then I set up camp in a small grove of oak trees. I hadn't seen another person out there, and the trail looked less used than I expected. But I loved how much wildlife I'd seen. I made a fire and heated up one of my dad's MRE dinners, and to my surprise, the military packaged beef stew didn't taste bad at all. Before heading to bed, I made sure that everything was stored away carefully so as to not attract animals. I fell asleep within minutes of crawling into my tent. Sometime later I woke up, and it took me a moment to remember where I was. I lay still, trying to figure out what had pulled me out of my slumber. After a few minutes, I didn't hear a thing, so I wrote it off as a dream and fell back into a light sleep. The next time I woke up, I could see the moon shining through the tent window, and I could hear soft, lovely music. My first thought is that it sounded like the kind of flute you hear in Celtic songs, but the longer I listened, the more it sounded ethereal and out of sync. It was as though multiple instruments were playing, and the rest of the nocturnal forest sounds had ceased. I untangled myself from my sleeping bag, and I carefully unzipped my tent so that it didn't make any abrupt noise. I didn't think I was in any particular danger, but I wanted to be cautious, since it was admittedly weird to hear random music in the middle of nowhere at 3 a.m. I let my eyes adjust to the moonlight. With it being a full moon, I could see my campsite well enough. Everything was in place, and I didn't see anyone around. The music sounded like it was coming from off to one side of the clearing, and it didn't sound particularly close. I popped my head back into my tent long enough to grab boots and a flashlight. Then I closed the tent up behind me and began to follow the sound. I was intensely curious, and I figured that if I maintained a good distance from the noise, no one would even know I was there. I crept along the clearing, trying to keep to the shadows while making my footfalls light. I followed the haunting music into the darkness, my senses on overdrive as I tried to track it. I wasn't the best woodsman, but I liked to think that I could handle this. After about 10 minutes, I came to a halt, my chest squeezing in a moment of blinding panic. Whoever was playing the music was probably perfectly friendly, but on the off chance that they weren't, I realized that I had nothing to defend myself with. Sure, I could always punch them, but that wouldn't do me any good if they had a weapon on them. I scoured the ground for a moment until I found a sturdy, thick branch. I tucked it under my arm, cradling it as I advanced. It took me another 5 minutes, but I soon found the source of the music. As I got closer, I shut my flashlight off, and I waited to see who was there. It took my brain a moment to process what I was seeing. I had expected a person to be sitting at a campsite playing music, but all I saw was a deer. The clearing it stood in was flooded with moonlight, and the lighting was bright enough that I wished I had my camera with me. After a minute, it raised its head from the berry bush it had been grazing in, and that was when I saw that this was not a deer. Its single antler was long and spiraled, almost like a gazelle. But I could see that each prong had a hole in it. The antler was acting like a pan flute, since it made a musical sound whenever the breeze blew across them. I studied it in fascination, and that was when I realized that we weren't alone. On the edge of the clearing, several animals had poked their heads out, and they were cautiously surveying their surroundings like me. They were all drawn toward the deer-like creature, and they seemed to be as interested in the music as I was. Each time the wind blew, the animals crept a bit closer, and soon I could see that there was a weird mix of them. I could make out a couple of striped hyenas, a snake, some Persian fallow deer, some rabbits, and even a cow. I didn't even realize that Iran had whatever the deer thing was, much less hyenas, so that came as a surprise to me. As I tried to identify the rest of the creatures, a violent gust of wind began blowing, and the once silent animals instantly turned agitated. Over the enraged sounds of hisses, growls, bellows, and thumps, I could hear the music soar, but now it had a heavier, more aggressive quality to it. The animals began to turn on each other, and soon it was war. Biting, clawing, kicking, and stomping, they attacked each other until only two were left, the cow and one of the hyenas. They stood panting as they faced off against each other. They were covered in bloody gashes, and the cow looked like it was missing an eye. As the violent song ended, the cow shook its head as if it was trying to get a fly out of its ear, and the hyena let out a confused and scared whimper. Throughout the carnage, the horned thing had stood in the same spot, and I don't think it had moved a muscle. It finally stepped away from the bush, carefully stepping over carcasses and gore, until it stood in front of the remaining animals. They held their ground, and the hyena began to growl. The deer-like creature shook its head, and a piercing whistle-like noise sound came from its horn. It startled the animals, who both skittered away. I had no idea what I'd just witnessed. It had happened so brutally, so quickly, that it had been hard to keep track of every one animal, and I had to force myself to keep breathing steadily so that I wouldn't vomit. I had never seen bloodshed like that, and I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. As I began to back away, the creature daintily made its way into the center of the clearing, and to my disgust, it began to feed on the slain creatures. I could hear bones snapping wetly, and that was when my stomach betrayed me. I threw up, and when I stopped heaving, I looked up to see that the creature was gone. But I could still smell the blood and viscera in the air, which sent my stomach into another wave of nauseated cramps. I made it back to my tent, practically crawling at some points, and that night I barely slept. What little sleep I did get was filled with nightmares, and without hesitation I cut my trip short. When I had internet service again, I spent some time trying to figure out what it was. What I found was the shadavar. The easiest way to explain it is by calling it a carnivorous unicorn. They were thought to have gone extinct in Iran hundreds of years ago. The types of animals they enjoy feeding on respond to the sound of their horn. By the time those animals hear it, it's too late for them to escape. It's a fascinating creature, but I sure hope I never see one again. If you find yourself alone in the woods, don't panic. It'll be okay. Just walk to the nearest tree line and stay as quiet as possible. You'll be perfectly fine, unless you feel that breathing on the back of your neck. If that happens, it's over. Close your eyes and hope it's over quickly. I was a young teenage boy living with my dad in a small rural town of about 5,400 people. We had recently moved because my dad found a better paying job here. It was a quiet little town with not much to do, but the work was good, so we stuck to it. I went to a nearby school there about 2 miles away from my home and would have to walk there every day. My dad usually woke up very early and would be out of the house before I woke up. It wasn't a big deal though, and I quickly got used to walking the 2-lane roads alone. There was this one particular shortcut that I would go through though, where I could save about 15 minutes along my route. It was one of those gravel pathways that connected the 2 main roads together, and it was usually empty, which meant I'd have to go alone for a few minutes as I walked through it. There were significant gaps between the houses, being a heavily wooded area, So my dad said to always take the main road, but I always wanted to get home earlier, so I took it. Along the pathway there was a run-down, abandoned-looking house which had definitely not been taken care of. Its windows were dusty and there was old garbage strewn about all over the place. Everything about it made my fear senses perk up. When I walked past it, I would sing out loud to myself, trying to banish my fearful feelings. I knew it was useless, though, but it made me feel better. One day, I was walking home from school, and it started to get pretty cloudy outside. A strong thunderstorm was growing, and heavy clouds were making it darker than usual. I wanted to get home as fast as possible because I didn't want to get soaked, but to do that, I would have to take the gravel shortcut. The road was already pretty dark, considering the cloud coverage combined with the dry weather. If it was this dark on the main road, it would definitely be much darker on that pathway. But I didn't think of that then. I weighed my options, took a moment, but I bravely made the decision to take the shortcut, just so I could get home quicker. After all, I'd done it so many times before, so I thought I'd just run through it and be done with it. It was a long, long drive. I thought I'd just run through it and be done with it. It began to rain heavily, and the thunderous roars grew louder. I lowered my head and began to walk faster. I eventually got to the pathway and looked into it. To my utter dismay, it was pretty spooky. I stared for a moment at the pathway, weighing my options again. I didn't really want to turn around, though, and go back the long way, only to get more soaked, and by now my house was literally so close. I knew the pathway pretty much by heart, and didn't really need that much light to get through it, so I decided to keep going. I began going with a quick stride, instead of a walk now. It got darker fast, the further that I went in. My whole body was telling me to turn around, and to go the long way, but I was already halfway through it. I quickly picked up the pace and went on. Soon, I was 3/4 through the way, and was about to pass that old rusty house. I was running pretty fast at this point, and freaking out too, as I was all alone in this dark, wooded place, with the ominous sounds of rumbling thunder all around me. I passed the house and decided to take a quick glance at it. I looked at one of the windows, and my heart suddenly stopped. This clearly noticeable silhouette, with dimly lit red eyes, was just staring at me. I felt a cold chill engulfing my body, like it was touching my insides. I must have had an overload of adrenaline at this point, because I suddenly got this jolt of energy and was out of there before I knew it. I got home in a daze, not sure if I had imagined that red-eyed thing or not, and my whole body was aching and felt weak. Being at least an hour before my dad would get home, I went to my neighbor's house and told them what I saw. They were quite skeptical, but they comforted me and were very understanding. When my dad heard about my story, he was kind of mad at first, as I did not take the main road home as he told me to. But he got over it. We went back there together sometime afterward, in order to check out who lived there, to see what that old creepy place was all about. Turns out that a 90-something-year-old couple was living there, but the wife had recently passed away, and the man was bedridden for a while. So who did I saw in the window? Or what did I saw? I still don't know to this day, but I never dared step foot on that road alone after that, nor will I ever take that route again. Back in 2022, I was at an Aboriginal camp in Wallumbie, New South Wales. I had been there for 5 years prior to this experience, and this was my last year there. We had heard stories of these creatures, called the hairy men. You may know them as the Yowie. From my best recollection, they told us that these creatures were short, had 6 fingers, and were completely covered in hair. However, one thing I had not remembered hearing was that they are said to take children through solid objects, children that were never to be seen again. I was told this by my cousin, and it always stuck with me. Well, behind our camp, there's a short trail, and there's a cave at the end of it, where we could see one handprint, an odd-looking one, among the other normal handprints. You could tell that the handprint hadn't been artificially made or altered. It was just a natural hand with one extra finger. Throughout my prior 5-year experience at this camp, during the first nights, we would be told the story of the hairy men. Then they would take the bravest of us kids up to the cave where we'd spend a few minutes inside, alone or with a friend. I would even go up during this time period, but I never went alone. On my last year there in 2022, I decided that I wanted to get over my fear. I was sitting in the cave near the back wall with only a slight gap and a bit from the entrance with my friend and a new kid. They were about to leave, and I told them that I would stay. I wanted to be alone in this cave for the first time. I wanted to see what there was to it and get over my fear of it. No more than 20 seconds after being alone, I felt a hairy hand rest on my back. There was warmth and pressure to it, so I was certain it was a living thing. I could clearly see the entrance, though, and knew that no one else should be in here. I froze up instantly, with a chill running down my spine. What seemed like forever slowly passed by until another person appeared at the entrance to the cave. When I saw them, despite still feeling that hand on my back, I began to cry out and sob. I demanded that that person go get a teacher or elder right away. I ran out of the cave then, and I was visibly shaken. I'd always been skeptical of these stories until then, but that night my mind was changed. It wasn't until my cousin told me about the taking kids part that I realized that I might have been lucky, that the creature that hand belonged to did not take me right then and right there. That may have actually happened if that other kid didn't enter the cave in time. Beware the Yowie, beware the hairy men. I have no idea what I saw from RD-27. It's been a few years since this all happened, so I'll try to recall the details as best I can. I was 14 years old and had always been an avid outdoorsman. I loved nature, I loved just being outside, but I mostly enjoyed hunting and fishing. I'd recently moved to a new neighborhood and became friends with a kid my age a few doors down. We lived off of a small side street in a large neighborhood, with houses on both sides of the road. Behind our houses, though, there was a small section of clear yard, followed by a sparse pine forest. These woods were on a slope leading down to a mostly dried-up creek bed. Occasionally, this creek would have small amounts of water running through it, leaving the dirt below quite moist and perfect for finding animal tracks. This was one of the main reasons that me and my new friend Hunter would always love to walk along this creek, looking for animals to track and hunt. Hunter would always bring along his pellets, looking for things like raccoons and squirrels to nail. And I would bring my hunting bow, which was good for raccoons too, and even coyotes. I would occasionally even go after a squirrel or two myself, though they could be difficult to hit with a bow. We began to see coyote and raccoon tracks lining the creek bed. This seemed like the perfect opportunity for a night hunt, as both raccoons and coyotes are more active at night. Now there is something else I have to mention here before we go on. I never really gave it much thought, and I'm only now realizing as I write this that there may have been a connection between this and what I would later experience. There was another set of tracks here that I always found in the creek bed that unnerved me, yet also intrigued me. It was a track like nothing I'd ever seen before, and even when I tried to look it up online, there was not a single known track like that in all of North America. I brushed it off as being a strange indentation made by rocks or something, but the tracks kept coming back, even after heavy rains, often in different spots, but they always were shaped the same. The tracks were hard to describe, but I'll do my best. Have you ever seen a cloven hoof print left behind by a deer that gives the impression of two separate toes? Imagine taking 3 much skinnier versions of these toes and sticking them side by side. That's basically what it looked like. Before you ask, I did think of the possibility that these could be overlapping deer tracks, but the symmetry of them and the recurrence of them made that explanation an impossibility. Now moving on to the story. I was over at my friend's house because his house had easier access to what I thought was a better hunting spot along that creek. I had gone over around sunset. We basically just played video games, watched YouTube, and alternated between sleeping and hanging out until about 1 a.m. Now I should say that I've never been inherently scared of the woods, having grown up around them my whole life, but honestly, the dark woods in the middle of the night did sort of give me the creeps. If you ask me, anyone in their right mind would be at least a little thrown off by complete darkness apart from the dim moonlight casting ominous shadows around you. Anyway, I took my bow in hand and nocked an arrow. I was using hunting arrowheads that could definitely do some good damage. Hunter had a red flashlight in hand. We used red because most animals cannot see the red light, although humans can. We walked out of his back door and made our way toward the woods. As you first enter the woods in his backyard, you had to wind around some trees, heading back to the creek, but there was a pretty well-worn deer trail leading back to it. Hunter was walking in front of me because he had the light, and I was following not far behind, making sure that my arrow did not stab him in the back. We were walking slowly because we had walked up on and spooked a few raccoons before, so we were trying to avoid doing that again. We got about halfway to the creek when we both stopped. Have you ever had that feeling that something is watching you? That feeling that something isn't right? Well, we both got it at the same exact time. Almost immediately after getting this feeling, we heard a rustling noise off to our left side. Hunter quickly shone the flashlight in that direction, and we were met with these eyes. Not just a single pair of eyes, but about 14 pairs of eyes in total. I didn't exactly think to count the number at the time, but they were all staring straight at us. It was not unusual for us to see eyes of an animal like this, as the eyes of most forest critters would reflect the light of a red flashlight. These eyes were low to the ground and spread out over a small area directly off to our left. I couldn't tell whether they were coyotes or raccoons, but either way, I knew I didn't like this situation. It was only after one more pair of eyes revealed itself that I truly became scared. In the center of a group, I noticed one more much larger pair of eyes. It wasn't the size of the eyes that freaked me out. It was how tall they were, or how far they were off the ground. Now, I've never been very tall, only standing about 4'10" at the time of this story. But I was looking up at this pair of eyes, not just a little bit either. These eyes were a good 2 to 3 feet higher than my own head. I guess we must have both seen those eyes together, because without a word, we both took off running out of there as fast as we could, sprinting the entire way back before panting to catch our breath. I nearly dropped my bow during my run, but managed to hang on to it. Needless to say, we were both scared out of our minds at first, our adrenaline pumping, and we were freaking out. It took us a while to rationalize the situation, but we eventually were able to come up with a logical explanation. Perhaps it was a raccoon who was perched on a tree branch. Now, of course, that doesn't explain the size and differences in the eyes, but I was eventually able to chalk that up to my eyes playing tricks on me, or even just a slightly larger raccoon. After we had calmed down a bit, we laughed it off, making fun of ourselves for getting so scared so easily. We set an alarm and decided we'd go back in a few hours after getting some sleep. When we woke up, I realized that we had either slept in or the alarm had failed to go off, so it was 10 in the morning by this point. We decided that even though we had missed our second hunt of the night, we would go back out there and take a look at where we'd seen those eyes before. We were hoping to see some tracks that might tell us what was there. We weren't quite in the creek bed yet, though, so the chances of tracks showing up was not very high, but we wanted to check anyway. This brings us to the next part that still scares me to this day, and I'm even looking over my shoulder in paranoia as I type this. We went back to the spot where we'd seen all those eyes, and I didn't even make it to where they were standing. Both of us bolted out of there for the second time, as we were now clearly able to see the area where the animals had been standing. And the fact that they were standing in the center of a small 25-foot clearing that we had cleared out years ago so we could camp there overnight meant that there were no trees for anything to hang from or climb, no bushes for something to sit on, absolutely no low-hanging branches, nothing but leaves. Still, to this day, I have no idea what we saw out there, and I still get freaked out every time I step into the woods while it's dark out. I don't go out at night without a flashlight, and I definitely don't go unarmed. I haven't been able to get that image out of my head. It's like I can still see those eyes looking back at me after all these years. I live in northeastern Oklahoma, and I'm part Native American. Indigenous people lived here long before my time. I went on my usual evening walk one day at about 5:30, which I did every day. I usually go down my quarter-mile-long driveway and onto the road, but today I decided to go along a trail into the woods behind my house. I connected my AirPods and listened to my playlist. As I got deeper down the trail, the sun got blocked out more and more by the canopy. After 20 minutes in, the sun was already down, which was normal this time of year, being winter after all. I kept going on my walk and eventually checked my phone. It had been 2 hours, as it was 7:30 now. I decided in my head that I would go back home after a few more minutes, as I was enjoying myself much more than usual. The path was much more quiet and peaceful. Now, sometimes when I'm alone, I talk to myself. I'm sure that most people do this, but most people don't expect a reply when they talk to themselves, especially when they're alone. But that day, I got a reply. I had simply said, "I'll be back home in a few," under my breath, and immediately, as if responding to that statement, I heard my own mother's voice calling out to me from seemingly nowhere. It said, "Abby, ven a ayudarme," which was Spanish for, "Abby, come help me." I stopped, and panic flooded over my body. I was 100% sure this was not my mother. She was back at home. She wouldn't have known I made a mental decision to go on to this trail instead of my usual route. I turned to run, but saw this thing not too far from me. A deer standing on all fours, except it wasn't a normal deer. The thing appeared to have rotted years ago. There was barely any flesh left to hang from its skeletal bones. I watched its skull-like head twitch to the left, then to the right, and then look at me. Then that voice came again, as it opened its mouth. I ran back to my nanny's house, since the woods behind our houses were shared. I ran faster than I ever ran my whole life. I heard a galloping set of footsteps behind me the whole way. Instead of climbing over the barbed wire fence, I dove under the bottommost line. I nearly made it through without incident, but I ended up cutting my arm open. The cut wasn't that bad, but it was enough to make me wince. When I made it to the house, it was thankfully unlocked. I ran inside, then slammed it shut, locking everything down. I peered out the window then, to find that the creature had stopped at the tree line just before the fence. It made eye contact with me, still twitching, before then walking back into the forest. I heard an Australian shepherd Lucy, an outside dog that came around when hearing the door. She was barking ferociously at the creature. Eventually, everything went silent. Then the dog ran back to the other side of the house to the porch. I let her in to keep me company. Then I locked the door again. When my nanny found me, she asked me what was wrong. I explained everything to her, the description of the creature and all. She looked taken aback and just called my mom, who came over to pick me up. My mom is not a believer in the paranormal, so I told her that I had been chased by a bobcat. I never bothered to tell anyone I knew except my best friend about this incident. Ever since then, I only walk on my road, and I don't dare go into those woods anymore. Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed it.